This is the Acer Helios 16, a somewhat mid-range gaming laptop that, on the whole, does a pretty good job. There's plenty you should know before buying though, so let's get into it. Starting with the exterior, this is a pretty sleek design, yet thanks to the junk in the trunk, it's unmistakably a gaming laptop. You get RGB lighting on that stick-out section behind the display, which while it does look nice, is a little confusing considering you'll never see it. Otherwise, it's a pretty plain clamshell. Spec-wise, my model came with an i5's 13700HX, 30 gigs of DDR5 RAM, an RTX 4060 laptop GPU with 8 GB of VRAM, and a 1TB SSD. That's not too bad, but of course, we should see how all of that performs, starting with the gaming results at the native 1600p resolution. On average, on generally medium to low settings, you're getting around 150 FPS. Some games, the more esports titles, offer hundreds of FPS. Siege is up at 400 FPS average, CS2 is near 300 FPS, although anything more intensive and you're looking at more like 90 FPS or so. Some are higher. Hitman's GPU data reports 115 FPS average, but games like Starfield, Flight Simulator, and even Fortnite on high all fall below or around about sort of 70 or even 60 for Fortnite. I must admit that I really don't understand why we're putting 1600p displays on 4060 laptop systems, especially 240Hz panels too, but we are, so there you go. Interestingly, at 1080p, for the sake of comparison, this turns out to be pretty much exactly what you would expect for a 140W TGP 4060 and a fast Intel CPU. In Cyberpunk, it's functionally tied with the XMG Focus 16 and the Acer Helios Neo 16 at around 125 FPS average or so. Shadow of the Tomb Raider ran a tiny bit slower than the average 4060 machine, although it's still in the mix, so that's no problem. One interesting result is Hitman 3, where the built-in benchmark splits out the CPU and GPU results, and this is the GPU data, and here we see a pretty promising result. For a 4060 laptop GPU anyway, it's only 2 FPS behind the highest 4060 base machine I've tested, so that's great to see. Rainbow Six Siege is right up at the top end too, functionally matching the Helios Neo 16 with the same config. In short, this is a pretty decent machine for gaming and is right in line with the other i7 and 4060 machines that I've tested. As for the CPU performance, Cinebench shows great results. It's right up against the Neo with the same spec, and towards the top of the charts here. Single-threaded performance was a touch slower than I would have expected, but it's certainly close enough. Blender actually shows a touch better performance than the Neo, and the best of the i7 class of chips that I've tested. It turns out that's because the Helios 16 was able to draw more like 97 watts from the CPU during those renders versus 83 watts on the Neo. That isn't the absolute highest number I've seen and is very typical for a higher end Intel CPU, but it is still worth keeping in mind for the battery life and thermal output. As for the display, as I mentioned, this is a 1600p 240Hz panel, and a pretty decent one at that. I measure just shy of 500 nits of peak brightness, which is great, and around a 1300:1 contrast ratio. That's perfect, enough brightness to use in a brighter environment without issue for sure. It's also remarkably vibrant. Content looks really nice on this, and I would say to the eye it looks rich and nicely saturated. It also covers over 100% of the DCI-P3 spectrum, which is just excellent. And to top it off, it's remarkably accurate. The Spider-X2 reported an average delta E of 0.88 with no result over 2, so that is genuinely fantastic. When it comes to the more gaming-related tests, the display actually lists itself as a 3 millisecond panel on a sticker right on the display, and it's actually pretty close to being correct. If you use the much more lenient VESA standard tolerances, it does actually come out to around 3 milliseconds on average. With my more strict testing method though, it's more like 6 milliseconds with overdrive on, and with a tiny bit of overshoot. But on the whole, it's a decent user experience. Here's the high-speed footage from Aperture Grill's Frog Pursuit test, and as you can see, there's functionally no ghosting, with only a tiny bit of inverse ghosting visible. I think Acer has tuned this overdrive very well, and means that you are getting the best out of this panel that you can. I'm also happy to report the input lag results are about right too. OSRTT measured around 2.5 milliseconds of on-display latency, which is right around half the refresh rate, and very few results take longer than 1 frame to render. All of that combines to a great gaming experience. The display is smooth, responsive, and sharp, especially if you're playing at the native 1600p resolution. For more esports titles like Siege, you get enough performance from the 4060 and the i7 that it's a great experience even at 1600p. I enjoyed playing on this with all the games that I was using for testing, so I'm pretty confident in saying that this is a great gaming machine. If you're wondering about the keyboard, it's fine. It's a little mushy and soft for my tastes, but it's more than serviceable, both for gaming and typing. The trackpad is equally fine. It's a good size, palm rejection works well, and it still has all of the gestures you would expect. No problems there. As for I/O, you get 2 USB-C Thunderbolt ports, 3 USB-A ports, HDMI, Ethernet, an audio jack, and DC in. That's fine, although I would note that the power input, which is on the back, is actually a really thick barrel jack and a really sort of straight barrel jack, which means you need a lot of space behind the laptop to be able to plug it in. Also, the power brick is massive. Taking a peek inside after removing a bunch of T6 Torx screws, not Phillips head, so you will need a more specialist toolkit, you'll find 2 DDR5 SODIMM slots, a spare M.2 slot, and a very loose 90Wh battery. This model came with 2 16GB DDR5 DIMMs and a 1TB Micron SSD. I should mention that the cooling package here does a pretty good job. It's on the louder side, although it's exclusively air movement noise, not whine from the fans themselves. And lastly, I should mention the price. At least at the time of filming in the UK, this model is listed for £2,000 on Acer's website. While that is in line with some of the similarly spec'd machines that I've tested, I'd be negligent to not mention that the Helios Neo 16, I've mentioned several times throughout this video, is currently available with the exact same specs, save for 165Hz display and 16 gigs of RAM, is available for just £1,300. That is much more in line with what I feel an i7 and 4060 system should be, and that's the one I would recommend. If this Helios 16 ends up being on sale for £1,400, it's likely worth the extra for the nicer display and more RAM, but as it stands, this isn't where I'd put my money. It's a great machine, but not for that price. Of course, with that said, I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments down below. What do you think of the Helios 16? Is this a machine you'd pick up yourself, or would you go for that Neo 16 instead, or something else entirely? Let me know in the comments. I'll also leave a link to this in the description if you want to check it out, and if you want to support these videos, you can hit the subscribe button to see more of them when they come out. You can also check out plenty of other videos in the end cards, and if you want to be able to test stuff like laptops yourself, I make my own hardware, the open source response time tool and open source latency testing tool, available at osrtt.com. There's also a load of other links in the description if you want to check them out and support the channel, but otherwise, thanks for watching, hope you enjoyed it, we'll see you on the next video.